Okay, well, we are 2 minutes after the hour, and it looks like we have a good number of folks on, so why don't we begin? Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sprague, and I'm the Vice President of Government Relations for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We are excited to present today's webinar, which will focus on important actions advocates can take now to support historic preservation efforts at the federal level. It's been a busy few weeks from a legislative standpoint with significant implications for historic preservation. And so we appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. Our discussion is going to focus on three areas of preservation policy: efforts to improve the federal historic tax credit, funding both for fiscal years 25 and 26 for the Historic Preservation Fund, and an important update on the administration's efforts to reform the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So each of these policy areas has an associated advocacy action or an ask, and we would be grateful for your continued engagement and support. Before we begin, I wanted to cover a few webinar logistics. First, we want to hear from you. If there are areas of federal policy that you would like to hear more about for future content development, please send us your suggestions. And if you have questions, please submit those through the chat or the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer questions both with the content during the webinar and questions that we can answer during the webinar. But for most questions, I anticipate that we will not be able to get to, and we intend to follow up after the webinar with a frequently asked questions post, as we have done after previous advocacy webinars. Second, the closed captioning function is enabled for the webinar. You are able to enable it and disable it either through the controls at the bottom of your Zoom screen or through your audio settings. And lastly, following the program, we will send out a recording of today's webinar directly to the email that you use to register. And just a reminder that all National Trust webinars are available on our YouTube channel. Common courtesy, as a reminder, we ask everyone to follow our code of conduct in the chat, and please keep the comments polite. And with that, I want to thank you, our audience, for joining today. This work would be impossible without you, and we are grateful for the dedication and determination of the preservation community. Joining me today are members of the National Trust Government Relations team: Pam Bowman, our Senior Director of Public Lands Policy; Lauren Cohen, our Associate Director of Government Relations; and Jackson Bunis, our Associate Manager of Policy Communications. We are also pleased to be joined today by Albert Rex. Albert is no stranger to preservation, having worked in Boston for the last 30 years, first as a preservationist and now as a historic tax credit advisor. Albert serves as the principal of the Historic Tax Credit Group at Ryan LLC, an award-winning global tax services and software provider. In just the last year, the HTC group at Ryan has helped their clients secure over $500 million in federal and state historic tax credits for rehabilitation projects. Albert is also the current chair of the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, a coalition we work closely with. They are an advocacy organization dedicated to improving and expanding the federal historic tax credit. So we have a full program today, so I want to jump quickly right into our material. As I mentioned, today's presentation will focus on federal appropriations and historic preservation funding, HTC advocacy, post-HR 1, and efforts to streamline the regulatory environment, including changes to the way NEPA is administered. We'll describe for each of these federal policy areas and what advocates can do to best support historic preservation policies at the federal level. So without question, the most significant legislative accomplishment of the 119th Congress has been enactment of H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Act. H.R. 1 was pushed, some might say, forcibly pushed through the Senate and the House in the days leading up to the 4th of July holiday. You are probably aware that the bill advanced through the reconciliation process, which limits what can be included in the bill, but it also allows the legislation to move through the Senate, but with a simple majority vote, as opposed to the more customary 60-vote threshold, which is needed to avoid the filibuster. The bill includes both spending cuts and tax cuts, with the Congressional Budget Office estimating an increase in the deficit by approximately $2.4 trillion over 10 years. This spending was accompanied by $1.3 trillion in spending cuts. Importantly, H.R. 1 extends the debt limit by $5 trillion. This amounts to approximately 1.5 to 2 years of federal borrowing needs, which would potentially avoid the need for Republicans and Democrats to come together to reach a difficult bipartisan agreement before the midterm elections. The bill is really just too massive to cover today in great detail. So our discussion is going to focus primarily on the advocacy efforts that went into our work to include HTC provisions in the bill, and what happened with that effort, and where it fell short. I did, however, want to quickly mention a few other provisions that have the potential to impact historic preservation efforts. With regard to charitable deductions, H.R. 1 makes several changes that will have different impacts on sectors of charitable giving. So those include the universal deduction, which can be found at section 70424, and that is expected to encourage more individual giving at smaller levels. But there could also be disincentives for charitable giving in the form of caps for higher income individuals. That can be found in section 70111, and a higher floor for corporate deductions, as well as a tiered excise tax on foundations. That can be found at section 70425, which could dampen the charitable giving impact. Time will tell. We'll see how these changes play out. I also wanted to note that section 50304 in H.R. 1 rescinds $267 million in unobligated yet congressionally approved funding for the National Park Service, which was intended to support staffing needs. And this rescission is in addition to existing staffing shortages and the current hiring freeze. So this all has the potential to impact the NPS workforce, as well as deleterious effect on the impact to park operations. Finally, I'll note that section 50305, celebrating America's 250th anniversary, appropriates $150 million for the Department of the Interior, administered through the Park Service, for events, celebrations, and activities associated with the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding. So our time is, just final comment, our time is unfortunately limited today, so we're really just scratching the surface in terms of the policies H.R. 1 puts in place. We do anticipate sharing additional analysis in the coming communications later this month about impacts to historic preservation. So in the meantime, please subscribe to the National Trust Advocacy newsletter and send us your feedback on how federal policies are affecting your work. Now, I would like to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Lauren Cohen, who will provide an update on federal appropriations and funding for historic preservation.
Thank you, Shaw, and great to be with everyone today. I'm going to talk a little bit about federal funding and appropriations and how federal funding supports our work in preservation, and the advocacy that we've done to make some of that funding come through, and the work that is still yet to be done for future funding. So let's start first with fiscal year 2025. So that's the fiscal year that we are currently in. And just over 2 weeks ago, on July 1st, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, released the long-stalled Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, for state and tribal historic preservation officers to apply for their fiscal year 2025 annual funding. So you'll think to yourself, well, if this only was released on July 1st and we are well into the fiscal year, that must mean that there was a long delay, and you would be exactly right. This funding was fully funded by Congress in March and signed into law by the president in March of 2025. So the delay was many months long, and it threatened the work of SHPOs and TIPOs across the country and put historic places at risk. And after robust grassroots and targeted advocacy from a very dedicated coalition of national historic preservation organizations, we're very relieved that this funding, or this notice of funding, has been released to begin the application process for annual funding for these SHPOs and TIPOs. You'll see here on the screen some images of some of that coalition work, one-pagers and letters to OMB Director Russ Vought and Secretary of the Interior Secretary Burgum. So we did a lot of this work, both behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, and so we are very relieved that this is kind of behind us. And I just want to note that our work is made better and more inclusive and more effective by participating in coalition advocacy and strategy like this. So we're really grateful for our colleagues from so many national organizations. I see many of you are actually joining us on this webinar today. So thank you so much for leading this work and joining us in this work. We watched very carefully some congressional hearings that happened in May and June with OMB Director Vought and with Secretary Burgum, where members of Congress directly questioned these administration officials about the stalled FY25 HPF funding. So we're grateful for those congressional champions stepping in to ask about that. So this period of waiting is now behind us. Again, I'll note that it's just that the notice has been placed for SHPOs and TIPOs to apply for this FY25 funding. So we're hopeful that that application process and review goes very quickly now to get those much needed FY25 funds over to SHPOs and TIPO offices. Regarding the notice of funding opportunities required for the FY25 competitive grant programs that are under the HPF, we have read recently that the National Park Service anticipates issuance of the grant notices later this summer and then into the fall as well. So we'll keep a watch on that, and we can include information about that in the newsletter that Shaw mentioned at the top of our webinar together. Go to the next slide. So our focus now is on securing fiscal year 2026 HPF and other funding. You may recall that each year, in the early spring usually, the sitting president releases a president's budget request, basically outlining how and at what levels the administration would like Congress to appropriate the many programs and agencies of the federal government for the coming fiscal year. So this year we got President Trump's budget request for fiscal year 2026 earlier this spring, which virtually zeroed out the Historic Preservation Fund, except for a very small amount for the competitive grants to fund preservation projects at historically Black colleges and universities. So we have been actively advocating against this scenario of zeroing out the HPF. We've done this advocacy all spring with advocates, many of you coming to Washington, D.C., going to meetings with us on Capitol Hill, sending letters into to your members of Congress. And we hadn't seen anything come out of the appropriations committees about whether they were going to support or refute the president's budget request until now. Because our timing for this webinar could not have been better, the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee released its bill on Monday of this week, and they voted along party lines to pass it after convening yesterday. So literally, this hearing and markup, which is what they call where they review their bill, their language for the coming year. This happened yesterday, July 15th. So the image you see here on the screen is of the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee members and a couple of other full Appropriations Committee members sitting there discussing and reviewing the language for the bill that they eventually did pass yesterday morning. So let's get into the components of this bill. So and I'll just pause real quick and note that this is kind of the first step. So it was passed through this subcommittee, which now it goes to the full House Appropriations Committee. Once it passes there, it will need passage from the full House of Representatives. And we'll kind of see a tandem process happening over on the Senate side as well. So this passage is just kind of the first step on the House side. It's not final passage. But let's get into what the bill did say. So for the Historic Preservation Fund, it kept it at level enacted funding with what we currently have for fiscal year 2025. That's $168.9 million. So we're looking at level funding there. It also included a 1-year extension of the authorization of the Historic Preservation Fund, which we're separately working on a longer term authorization, but I can talk about that at another time, but we're focusing on funding now. But it did include a 1-year authorization extension. For the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, for which we also advocate, we did see $5.7 million. This is a 33% reduction from their enacted level for fiscal year 2025. So that was a pretty steep reduction. Related also to our work, we sometimes see preservation funding coming out of the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities. We saw a 35% reduction from the enacted fiscal year 2025 funding. So that's a $72 million cut down to $135 million for both of those agencies. For those agencies, that's a funding level not seen since 2004. One positive thing we did see from this funding bill is that there is a prohibition on the Lava Ridge funding. This is a proposed wind project near the Minidoka National Historic Site in Idaho. So this was a priority for the subcommittee chairman, Mike Simpson of Idaho. So we did see prohibition of funding for that wind project there. I just want to note here that the overall bill was a 6% reduction from the enacted 2025 funding. So you think 6% reduction, okay, but kind of outliers or programs that saw much higher than 6% are there, the ACHP and the NEA and the NEH, a couple of other programs too, but we're glad to have seen that the reductions were not high for the Historic Preservation Fund, and that it's level funding there. So while we don't have a confirmed timeline for Senate action, it is critical that the preservation community prioritizes outreach to both House and Senate appropriators now, and that you continue engagement over the coming weeks. Earlier this spring, the National Trust submitted formal written testimony to the appropriations committees on both chambers, the House and the Senate, regarding our fiscal year 2026 funding asks, which among many other things, one of those asks that we made as the National Trust, but also it was an agreed upon coalition ask, was $225 million for the Historic Preservation Fund. Now, that is a pretty big delta there between what we're seeing here at 168.9 million. But as you know, we continue to face challenging situations in light of the overarching current federal interest in reducing spending. So our original ask of $225 million certainly remains justifiable and far from extravagant, because we are reflecting the needs of the field. However, we are mindful of the broader political pressures at play. I'll wrap up quickly just to kind of note what we're looking at next in terms of timelines. So I just want to note again that the timing of this webinar is so critical because a lot is happening and currently happening in the Senate side. So just to give you some information about this rescissions package that I have listed here, the Trump administration submitted a $9.4 billion rescissions package to Congress seeking to claw back congressionally approved funding from fiscal year 2025, specifically for some foreign aid funds and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So it's not funding that particularly pertains to preservation work, but I bring this up just because I want to demonstrate all of the things that are happening in Congress right now and how it's kind of sucking up a lot of time and oxygen. So Congress has until this Friday, 2 days from now, July 18th, to pass that package in both chambers. If it fails to do so, the president must spend those funds as appropriated. So it's already passed the House. Right this very moment, the Senate is debating how they want to approach this rescissions package. The reason I bring this up again is because it's taking up a ton of time in Congress, and it's time that they're not using to move quickly on an annual appropriations. Number two, I bring this up because congressional Republicans have moved this giant reconciliation package that Shaw already mentioned, and this rescissions package without any necessary votes from Democrats. So that changes with the annual funding in the Senate. 60 votes are required to pass annual funding in the Senate. So that means that at least 7 Senate Democrats are going to have to vote in favor of any potential continuing resolutions or anything like that, which would avoid a shutdown. Now, Senate Democrats have come out the gate saying that they would be unwilling to compromise when it comes to voting on continuing resolutions later this fall, just on the principle that this rescissions package is changing what they already agreed to in the last appropriations bill. So we're seeing that. Also, I just want to note, the government funding deadline is just 77 days away on September 30th. So far, it's not going well. We have seen a little bit of movement in subcommittees. Some other bills have passed, but there's a lot of talk of shutdown on both sides of the aisle and on both sides of the Capitol. So, you know, if you think 77 days is a lot of time, I'll just note that Congress actually only has 19 working days before September 30th because they have an August recess coming up where they're going to be home in their districts and states. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us to encourage members of Congress to support preservation priorities in their annual funding packages. And I will stop there, pass it along.
Thanks, Lauren. I think it's my turn. I'm Albert Rex. I am a principal of Historic Tax Credits at Ryan, and I am the current chair of the Historic Tax Credit Coalition. Many of you will know that the coalition has been working for the last year or two on getting moving forward on a bill, HTC Go, as you see here, HR 2941, Senate 1459. The HTC Go bill obviously is the Growth and Opportunity Act. There were a number of things in that bill relative to improvements to the historic tax credit that would cover a broad basis of building types, the coalition had worked hard over the last year or so with our major champion, which is Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, and Congressman Darren LaHood from Illinois are our two Republicans. And then we actually had two retiring Democrats. And so Senator Warner from Virginia and Representative Tom Suozzi from Long Island are the two Democrats that are in sponsors on the HTC Go bill. We were obviously working hard to get improvements to the credit, as many of you remember, during the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Two things happened. One, the 10% old building credit was eliminated, and the 20% credit went from being all available in 1 year to being available over 5 years, which negatively impact the amount of dollars brought in from the historic tax credit to a project. So one of the focus on the last year was really getting Senator Cassidy to support bringing the 1 year back. Mr. Cassidy had been the person who saved the credit in 2017, literally stood up, or 2018, in committee and said the historic tax credit's too important. What can we do to save it? And that's when we went to the 5 year. So we're trying to return to 1 year. Other components of it lowered the substantial rehab test. You have to spend more than your value of the building. So that's 100% substantial rehab. We're trying to lower that to 50%. There's a basis adjustment. When you use this historic credit, you actually have to lower the amount of value or basis in your building, which has a negative tax impact and can also affect affordable housing. We wanted to get rid of the tax-exempt lease rules or modify them. The tax-exempt lease rules basically say that something like a museum, a theater, a Y that was built by the people that are still occupying it cannot utilize historic tax credits to rehab it. And then finally, the last component of it was a kind of running off of a bill that Senator Capito of West Virginia put together to bring in more dollars for smaller projects. So a 30% credit bump for projects of $2.5 million or less. And then also a 30% credit bump for rural projects of $5 million or less. And including in that was transferability, much like some of the energy credits that are out there right now. So as we went through the process, nothing happened on the House side, unfortunately. The bill really came over to the Senate. Senator Cassidy worked very hard. If you followed anything that was happening with the bill, he was out proselytizing about it every day. He was in a hearing with Treasury Secretary Bessent and actually brought up the historic tax credit as being one of his major priorities. We were working hard thanks to the National Trust Investment Corporation, NTCIC. Mike Phillips is the chair of our advocacy group. He could not be here today, but he and Lauren Wilcox worked very hard at the beginning of the year. We had more outreach than ever around the historic tax credit. We had more than 1,000 points of contact in the first 100 days. So we really brought advocacy out. I think that advocacy helped, and as well as advocacy to the Senate Finance and House Ways and Means really helped push us forward. We were not outside of the bill. We were in the final discussions around the bill, even though we were not in it. We were working hard with our champions, including Mr. Scott from South Carolina, obviously Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins from Maine has always been a great supporter of the program to try to get some improvements to the historic tax credit into the bill up until the very last moment. And unfortunately, we did not quite get there. The good news is that we did not have any elimination, and we were not under the risk that we were in 2017, 2018. But we still have an opportunity this year to potentially see some improvements. Chairman Smith on the House Ways and Means has said that he could see or thinks there may be an additional reconciliation or a joint tax bill, a bipartisan tax bill put forward in the fall. With the new budget, there's also an opportunity for a new reconciliation bill. So we are going to continue to work hard, as we look through and try to figure out why we didn't quite make it. The one kind of murmur that has come out of the Hill and out of DC is that often folks see this as more of an urban credit or maybe not a more of a blue or tinged blue credit rather than a credit that supports red states or rural opportunities. We're working hard to kind of discredit that theory. Any of you on the phone or on the screen who live and work in smaller communities and rural areas know that the historic tax credit has worked just as effectively on main streets as it has in major cities. Some of the major users of these the credits are obviously states that are seen as being more red states, Louisiana, Ohio, Missouri. So the coalition's working very hard to figure out how do we do more to affirm the fact that the historic tax credit is not just blue or urban, that it really affects the entire country. It is the single largest investment at $1 billion a year that the federal government does in historic preservation. And as the note says here, one of the targets would be during August recess when folks are back in the community. It's a great time to get them out to historic projects. If you need any help or want any support from that, the coalition and the trust are happy to help you. You could reach out to Shaw or you can reach out to Mike Phillips. We're happy to reach out and support your congressional representatives or your senators relative to getting out to sites. We've found that the most impactful thing is actually have somebody see a building and see what the credits have done. I think it's also a great thing for historic preservation in general. I was an advocate for 10 years prior to being a historic tax credit consultant. So I've seen both sides of the table. I think, just in Lauren's presentation, it's clear that we sometimes are treated like the poor stepchild within the federal government. Yet historic preservation adds so much to our communities. We are really working hard to think about how do we put out a campaign, maybe editorials, other components to really support the fact that historic preservation takes many forms, including the historic tax credit. The best way to save an old building is to rehab it, and the government support and state support for those things are essential to making these projects actually happen. The other thing I will note is that the coalition has been supporting NICSPO right along with the trust and other organizations to fully fund the HPF. We have relationships with the Interior that we are working on. We certainly see the role of the State Historic Preservation Office, especially in the tax credit program, being critical, and that changing size in those programs is not useful or helpful. If there's a shrinking at the federal level, as many of you might know, the Technical Preservation Services, the group that oversees the historic credit, is down to about 17 folks right now. 14 of those are actually tax credit reviewers. Fully staffed, they'd be at 32. So another big action that the coalition is taking is to try to support TPS and making sure that we don't lose any more folks there. Similarly, with the National Register program, a couple folks took the fork in the road, or that's lost a little bit. But obviously, with HTCs, we're always looking at potentially listing new buildings in the register, and think the register program is super important. So we're in lockstep with our friends at the Trust and other organizations relative to how important HPF is and that support. We really appreciate any of you that might have participated in our 1,000 actions in the first 100 days. Really would love to hear more from our rural colleagues about how we might be able to dig a little deeper. A large portion of the historic tax credits years, but roughly half of them, or 600 or so projects, are $1 million or less. We don't always get to hear about those. So if you're in a rural community working on a project like that, we'd love you to reach out to Shaw or Mike or myself and let us know about it. We can use all the support we can get relative to making enhancements to the program, and I think the outreach can only enhance historic preservation in general as well. So thanks for listening.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Albert, for that overview of the HTC work. We wanted to share an overview of what's transpired so far in 2025 on issues related to the National Environmental Policy Act, and an opportunity for you to take action and be engaged on one of the most important laws protecting our nation's historic, cultural, and natural resources. The National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and the National Historic Preservation Act were enacted decades ago, within 4 years of one another, and are both foundational aspects of federal oversight of our nation's historic and cultural resources. NEPA is a critical component for historic preservation by integrating the importance of our shared cultural heritage in the review processes for federal projects. Things like highway or pipeline construction is an example of that. The NEPA process helps ensure that federal agencies engage in early analysis of project impacts and seeking public input prior to decision-making as they coordinate with SHPOs, TIPOs, and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. There have been numerous almost monthly developments related to the NEPA process so far in 2025. During our February webinar, we shared an overview of some of the early executive orders of this administration, including Unleashing American Energy, number 14154, that was issued in January on the first day of President Trump's second term. This executive order seeks to expand fossil fuel development and accelerate permitting for energy projects by reducing regulatory burdens, including limitations on reviews such as NEPA. The following month, on February 25, the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, issued an interim final rule repealing its NEPA implementing regulations, citing that executive order, and also court rulings that strip CEQ's regulatory authority. This action was expected because we knew changes may be imminent following court rulings in late 2024 that set the stage for the rescission of CEQ regulations. For example, in 2024, in November, in the court case Marin Audubon Society versus Federal Aviation Administration, the court found that CEQ never had the authority to issue binding NEPA regulations on other agencies. In response, the National Trust submitted detailed comments highlighting the importance of NEPA to the preservation of our nation's historic and cultural resources, while providing several issues for discussion. And ultimately, this CEQ interim rule went into effect on April 11, and federal agencies were urged to individually update their NEPA procedures within 1 year. Federal agencies acted quickly, and agencies like the Department of the Interior and Federal Highway Administration now have open public comment periods to weigh in on this process, and comments are due August 4. We'll be adding a link in the chat where you can find more information about the Department of Interior comment period. And all the while in the middle of this activity, the Supreme Court issued a ruling in May on a case called Seven County Infrastructure Coalition versus Eagle County. And the Supreme Court ruled here that agencies deserve broad deference when deciding what impacts to include under NEPA, limiting project reviews to direct and reasonably foreseeable effects. The decision overturned a lower court ruling that required analysis of indirect impacts of a project, with the Supreme Court noting that NEPA does not require such analysis. The ruling significantly narrowed NEPA's scope and is also expected to speed up NEPA reviews and accelerate federal project approvals and timelines. The National Trust will be submitting comments ahead of the August 4th deadline, and you also have an opportunity to be engaged on this issue. And we encourage you to join us as the preservation community makes sure our voices are heard as part of this process. We wanted to share a few key messages that you can include in your own comment letter. First, sharing the importance of NEPA. Make the case for why NEPA plays a critical role for historic preservation and our nation's historic and cultural resources, and that any NEPA reforms uphold the spirit of environmental and cultural stewardship the law was based on. Also acknowledge the administration's objective in a strategic way. We know the objectives of these NEPA reforms, in part, are stemming from the Unleashing American Energy executive order, and that the administration is seeking increased energy development and a streamlined process. You can reference the language in the executive order and note your agreement with the several mentions of the directives needing to be consistent with applicable law, and reiterate the importance of the NEPA review process for protection of historic and cultural resources. And if it's about a more efficient process, maintain early public review and consultation. Early public review and comment opportunities during the NEPA process reduces delays in project implementation. A valuable and necessary consultation process builds consensus between stakeholders, and all of these valuable elements of implementing NEPA have the chance to minimize litigation, which directly speaks to some of the issues raised by those seeking to modify NEPA. Also mention that historic preservation is not a barrier to progress. It's a path towards smarter, more resilient, community-grounded development. Historic preservation is also a tremendous source of economic development, and federal efforts to preserve our nation's historic and cultural resources help to economically invigorate cities, towns, and neighborhoods across the country. And finally, share specifics. If you have examples of successful consultations or effective NEPA processes, provide those. They help make the case that anecdotes about lengthy or detrimental NEPA procedures are few and far between. The National Trust will continue to stay engaged as federal agencies address the NEPA process, and we'll be sharing additional updates when they become available. We encourage you to join us as part of this process so we can make our voice heard on this important process that federal agencies are undertaking. I will now turn it over the presentation to my colleague, Jackson.
Thank you, Pam. I'm Jackson Bunis, Associate Manager of Policy Communication, and I want to take a moment to look at the real impact that our collective advocacy has made. First and foremost, advocacy works, and your voice truly matters. During our historic tax credit campaign from the end of 2024 to where we are now, supporters have sent over 30,000 messages to Congress with nearly 27,000 action takers. Some of those might be repeat customers, if you will, people sending more than one message, but that kind of sustained engagement is incredibly powerful and speaks to the deep commitment that we've seen across our community. We saw similar momentum around the Historic Preservation Fund with that campaign, where over 16,000 messages were sent and there were more than 7,000 action takers. These numbers reflect a meaningful and sustained effort to reach lawmakers and elevate preservation priorities. And these actions made a difference. Every message helps build visibility and support the programs we care about. And as my colleagues mentioned, it kept us in the discussions until the last versions of the bill and keeps us in the discussions moving forward. To keep this momentum going, we encourage you to stay engaged and to sign up for our monthly advocacy newsletter that my colleagues have been talking about. There should be links in the chats for everything that I'm talking about here. You can also visit our Action Center to quickly contact your representatives and to find other areas where you can take action. You can also use our advocacy toolkit to take advantage of the August recess. This is a key moment to connect with elected officials in your community. This toolkit includes a 10 tips for effective advocacy article written by Lauren Cohen and myself, as well as a plethora of new videos on our grassroots advocacy homepage. You can use these to your advantage and please share them with your network. With your continued support, we can keep driving real change for historic preservation. So thank you all for the work that you've done and the work that you're going to continue to do. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Shaw.
Well, thank you, Jackson. So that concludes our advocacy presentation. And again, thank you for joining. This work truly is just not possible without your engagement. So thank you for tuning in today. I want to thank my government relations colleagues for their excellent work and excellent presentations today. I also want to thank Albert Rex for joining us. We greatly appreciate the collaboration with the Historic Tax Credit Coalition and all the work that they've done to advance the federal historic tax credit. And we look forward to those future opportunities and bringing those to you. So thank you again for joining. I am now going to turn it over to my colleague, Priya, who will close out the webinar with a few important informational updates. But thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Shaw, and thanks to the rest of the government relations team for presenting all this very important information today. For those of you who didn't catch it in the chat, my name is Priya Chaya. I am the Associate Director of Content here at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And I just have a few things I wanted to let you know are happening in the next couple months, along with some upcoming webinars. So first of all, if you haven't heard, Pass Forward, our annual conference, is in Milwaukee this September. We have an in-person and a virtual component, so I hope you'll take a look at the link below and see what's going on and what you can access virtually or in person. Registration is now open, so we hope to see you there. And then in November, we have the National Preservation Law Conference, which will also have a virtual component, and the link is also provided in the chat. Thanks, Rhonda, and on this slide, and I'll include it all in the follow-up email. That registration is not live yet, but should be shortly. Next, we have a series of webinars that we've been hosting this summer in response to all the various things that have been happening. These 4 sessions focus on fundraising and job searching. We had one earlier in the summer. The recording is available at a link that I'll provide in the follow-up email. But we have 3 going on, one tomorrow, how to kickstart a fundraising program as a staff of one. One later in July on grant writing strategies, and then in early August, leveraging LinkedIn for stronger online networking. I do want to note that the fundraising ones, we will not be recording them. So we would encourage you to come live. What we're going to do instead is take the information that people share and what they ask and turn them into short pieces and share the slides from those sessions. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up about that shift in how we normally present material after the session. And then finally, as many of you might know, it's next slide, Jackson. It is our 75th anniversary. So I'm here to make the ask that if you find our work valuable and you are interested in supporting us, here are 2 ways that you can do so. We appreciate all of you being here as active members of the preservation community and value all of your input. And that's all I have for you today. So if you have any questions about this webinar, you want to reach Shaw or Albert or any of our government relations team, you can email forum@savingplaces.org and we will get you in touch with them. Also, check out our upcoming webinars again. And if you want to learn more about Preservation Leadership Forum, which is our professional membership program that hosts all of these wonderful webinars, the website is also on the page. Once again, thank you so much for being here with us today, and looking forward to seeing you at next and future webinars. Have a great day.